Hey, it's Breaking the News Plus on Thursday night. I'm a little casual today because we're in our fancy new Studio C. And we're with my friend Tim Johnson from the University of Minnesota. Tim talks about the Supreme Court with Breaking the News all the time. Extremely helpful, extremely knowledgeable. Tim, welcome to Breaking the News Plus.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
This case, birthright citizenship, goes before the Supreme Court today, oral arguments. And it's a big deal because basically the Trump administration in the early few days of round two, Trump 2.0, said, we want to end birthright citizenship. And legal scholars were like, wait a minute, you can't. It's in the Constitution. It's the 14th Amendment. So tell me how it goes from that executive order to today.
Yeah, so today gets into, I think maybe the balloon being sort of the air letting coming out of a balloon very slowly, because I think people really thought that this was going to be an argument about birthright citizenship, and it ends up being an argument about this technicality about whether or not lower court federal judges can stop this executive order from going into effect, while sort of skirting that issue of the actual question, which is, can the president literally violate a section of the 14th Amendment, which, as you noted at the top, guarantees birthright citizenship to anybody born or naturalized in the United States. So while the debate was about this technicality, you certainly saw the underlying issue of birthright citizenship come again and again and again. And the justices know that they need to deal with that issue. That wasn't necessarily the question in this case, but at least three of the justices, the three liberal justices, plus Justice Coney Barrett, at a minimum, are making sure that that birthright citizenship issue was not lost in what was discussed today.
Yeah, before we get to that, where it takes this kind of exit ramp, we, as the people, thought that they would be making that decision. And did you get any inference from listening to oral arguments today that you could kind of predict where the justices are, on birthright citizenship?
Yeah, I think that there is certainly a majority that is highly skeptical of the idea that a president, through executive order, can change the Constitution. We know that when the framers wrote the Constitution, not the amendments, but the Constitution proper, that there is one mechanism to change the document, and that is through the amendment process. And for lack of a better way of putting this, the easiest way to think about it is 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states ratifying that amendment, or 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. You don't have this here. You've got one signature by one person, albeit the president of the United States, saying that this section of the Constitution is now null and void. And there was clear skepticism that went across the ideological spectrum on the court that that is something the president could do.
Right, because if you thought about it, for people listening, watching tonight, whether or not they agree with the president on this particular issue and they want this to go one way or the other, you have to put the shoe on the other foot then. Let's imagine there's a different president, and that president, by executive order, strikes down the Second Amendment. People wouldn't want that.
100%. And you just took the example right out of my mind. And I don't think you're psychic, but I think we were both thinking about the same thing, because this is a politically charged issue that I think folks on the right side of that meaning the more conservative side of the ideological spectrum say this sort of makes sense. And I think folks on the more liberal side of the ideological spectrum would say exactly what you were thinking. And that is, if it can happen here, then the next Democratic president can simply say the Second Amendment ceases to mean anything, and there is no individual right to bear arms. And this is a problem that you get, either Republicans or Democrats or any other political party, when you are trying to put into effect policy only because you like that policy and you don't think about the future at all. And I'll give you one other example. That is the 22nd Amendment. The Republicans were unhappy that President Roosevelt ran for a third and then a fourth term, but they also ended up finding out in 1988 that they wanted Ronald Reagan to run for a third term, and realized that their anger from 40 years prior wasn't going to allow President Reagan to do so.
Got to play the long game.
Right.
So let's get to what actually happened today. So once the argument started, and to a listener like myself, I kept thinking, oh, they're not actually talking about the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship. It keeps being steered in another direction. And in simplest terms, what happened today? What were they talking about, and why were they not talking as much about what I thought was the issue before the court?
Right. So the first reason is relatively simple, although also a technical reason, and that is this case didn't come to the court through the normal process where a lower court decision made a ruling, one side won and one side lost. The side that lost got upset and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. This came through the court's emergency docket, which in 2025 is often known as the shadow docket, because it's a way for a case to get to the court in an expedited, very quick manner without fully being briefed, without having full oral argument, although they ended up having oral argument in this case. It just got to the court. And the reason it got to the court so quickly is that you had 3 different trial court judges at the federal level put injunctions on the executive order. And an injunction is just a fancy legal way of saying they said the executive order cannot go into effect.
Gotcha.
That clearly upset the administration, and they are the ones, that is the administration, asked for an expedited appeal. And so it went to the court. And so the debate today was whether or not lower court judges should have the power. If you're a federal court judge down on 4th Street here in Minneapolis, only dealing with cases out of Minnesota, should you be able to put an injunction on the entire country? So this is about individual judges having such wide sweeping power that they can say no to an executive order for everyone from Washington to Florida and from Alaska to Hawaii.
And so they're really ruling on that. Can a federal judge stop an executive order? I guess just that. And what do the justices say about that? What did you hear?
Yeah, so there were a couple of different lines of argument. So you had the 3 liberal justices, Sotomayor and Kagan and Jackson, really pushing and saying, look, if you aren't able to have lower court judges issue these injunctions, then how could you ever get to the U.S. Supreme Court? Because here's what we know. On average, it takes 3 to 5 years to get a case through the entire process to the Supreme Court. And so the 3 liberal justices are saying to the Solicitor General, John Sauer, what happens to these people who ostensibly have birthright citizenship during that 3 to 5 year span? Are they not citizens? Can they not get federal benefits? Because the judicial system moves slowly. So one line of argument was nationwide injunctions are something that judges should have the power to do because sometimes we just need to move really quickly as a judicial system. You had another line of argument that came from Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and he said, look, there's an easy solution to this, and you just make sure that people sue as class action lawsuits. And so you don't have individuals sue, you get a whole class of people, and sometimes that is hundreds, sometimes it's thousands, sometimes in this case it would be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, and they all sue under one lawsuit together as a class. That might be an easy way. And then finally, you had Chief Justice Roberts, who said, none of this matters really much in my mind because I think we can, as a judiciary, actually move quickly enough to solve this problem very soon. Although he was the only one of the 9 who was trying to push that particular argument. So you had different views, but from Kavanaugh to Coney Barrett, which are 2 of President Trump's appointees, along with the 3 liberal justices, were all indicating that they thought it was going to be difficult to rid lower court judges of this power because the impact would be so devastating across a whole variety of legal questions, and that there has to be a way to get cases like this that are of such high importance that need to be acted upon so quickly done. Okay. And so I think that there's a pretty good majority, or at least 5, which is all you need for a majority, to say no to the administration's request in this case. And I apologize for all of the loud noise outside of my room.
I can't hear it. Last question then, really. So when the court decides on this, do they decide on both things, the injunction question and birthright citizenship?
So I think that is a question that you and I won't know until they hand down the opinion, because the court, as you and I both know, does all of its work in private. But what I can tell you is that Justice Amy Coney Barrett is the one who pushed hardest to say, why is birthright citizenship not the question before the court right this very minute? she's the only one, again, like the chief, pushing a different argument, pushing that particular argument. On the other hand, she has three allies in the three liberal justices, and that means during the decision-making process that's going to happen behind closed doors, they probably only need to convince one more justice, and it seems it might be Brett Kavanaugh. And if they could get him to agree, they could also decide on birthright citizenship. My gut is they're only going to decide on the injunctions and that particular policy and leave birthright citizenship probably for the fall.
Interesting. All right. Well, as always, we wait for the decision to come, and then we'll talk about it again.
I look forward to it.
Tim Johnson from the University of Minnesota, thank you so much for joining Breaking the News Plus today.
Thanks, Jen.
Take care.